Does it seem like fly fishing for bass or panfish or pike or bonefish is completely different from trout fishing? Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. It's not. If you can fly fish for trout or carp or bluegill or permit or tarpon or literally anything else that swims, you have all the skills you need to catch any other fish. There are 4 key skills that overlap from species to species. And in this episode of Untangled, I'll lay out exactly what those skills are and show you how they overlap all the way from high mountain streams to saltwater flats. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I'm your host, Spencer Durant. I'm going to set the stage for the show this week with a story about carp fishing. So we're really branching out of our comfort zone here at Untangled this week, aren't we? Oh, it was about a half dozen years ago, and I had a buddy who was really trying to get me to go out and fish for carp. And this is when carp fishing was really reaching its zenith. It was very popular. It was everywhere in fly fishing media. You still see it, but if you've been around in fly fishing for a little bit, you probably remember the craze that was surrounding carp fishing there for a while. And this buddy of mine really wanted me to go out fish for carp, but I just didn't want to do it. They're gross. They look gross. They smell gross. They feel gross. I know some folks out there think carp look beautiful, but more power to you, I guess. I just don't see it. I guess beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But I really didn't want to fish for carp. I'd only ever had experience with them through spearfishing, and I just didn't have any respect for them either at that point. So my desire to go chase carp was basically non-existent. Well, my friend kept badgering me, telling me that, only the best anglers can catch carp on a fly rod. And so naturally that got to my pride a little bit, and I was like, well, my crap don't stink. I'm pretty good. I mean, look at me. I got this big beard and I got a Winston fly rod. I'm basically a real trout angler, right? So I wanted to go out and try it. I finally caved into my buddy and we went out. It was a spring day. All the rivers were high from runoff. And we went to this series of ponds that was in a business park right next to where I was living at the time. This is back when I lived in Utah. It was a lot of fun because we're standing on these manicured lawns and we're tossing flies while people are inside working. They're watching us. And you can see a little bit of their soul dying as they're in an office and I'm outside enjoying myself. It was a really subtle flex that I was unemployed and going to college at the time. Anyways, we get to these ponds and the water is crystal clear. You could see the fish blink. It was that clear. And the carp were cruising around. You could see them. And I knew the general idea behind carp fishing because I had seen enough videos about it. I'd read enough about it at that point that you wanted to throw a small streamer in front of a cruising fish. You want to let it sink, and then you just have to strip set once the fish eats it. Now, with carp, you almost will never feel the eat. When they swallow your fly, it's a completely sight fishing game because carp they've got a very sensitive mouth and they're notorious for spitting out a fly before you ever even feel them get that fly in their mouth. From what I understand about carp, and this might be incorrect or maybe incomplete, but they'll root around on the bottom. They'll stir up the mud and they'll spit out a lot of the mud and just keep the organic matter as they're eating. So they've got very sensitive mouths because of that. And they really will they're super sensitive to the hook or any synthetic materials and they'll spit it out and you will never feel it. So you have to watch them and you've got to strip set perfectly. So that part is a little bit tough. But my buddy made it out like it was some sort of huge, almost impossible challenge. And it was to a degree. It wasn't easy. I didn't waltz into it. I mean, at the time I was younger. I was a little bit more arrogant at the time. I hope I've come off that high horse in the years since between then and now. I really hope I have, because I really, like, all kidding aside, I used to think I was hot stuff, and no, I'm just an average angler who gets to fish a little bit more than other folks, and that's really all there is to it. But anyways, my buddy made it out like it's this huge challenge that is going to be really tough, and it was challenging to a degree, but it wasn't impossible. It didn't feel insurmountable. It was just different. It was different than trout fishing. And I liked that. I actually liked a lot of the aspects of carp fishing. I missed my first few fish that day because I set the hook too early. But once I connected on one and I got that strip set down, that fish just took me off. And it ran me, I think it ran me almost to backing, which you rarely get into backing with trout. I know you can, but you rarely get into backing with trout. So to actually see the backing knot on the reel, think, oh, crap, I really hope that's a good knot now. That was a fun experience to have. And I really, really did enjoy it. I still don't fish for carp too much. I don't go out of my way to chase them, but if the opportunity presents itself, I'll go after them because they are an enjoyable fish to catch on a fly rod. I still don't like to touch them. I'm still a little squeamish, which I don't know why that is, but other than not wanting to touch them, they're fine. They're a fun fish. But what's really interesting about carp fishing is how similar it is in a lot of ways to trout fishing. I had to make a very good, accurate cast. I had to select a reasonable fly. And then I had to make a good presentation. And then finally, had to get a good, solid hook set. If you've been listening to Untangled or you've watched any of the stuff here at VFC, how many times have you heard Alex and I talk about those things, about those concepts and about those skills? Probably a whole bunch, because those are foundational skills that you need, whether you're fly fishing for bass or tarpon or bumphead parrotfish. Whatever you're going after, you've got to know how to do those things. Presentation, fly selection, hook sets, all of that translates. There's going to be nuances for every fish that you chase, but it all translates from species to species, okay? And I know that we talk about trout at Untangled, and that's the lens that we view a lot of fly fishing through. And a lot of that's because that's what I do the most. I spend most of my time fishing for trout. I personally enjoy trout fishing more than just about anything else. The one, and it's probably a good thing I don't do it very much, but the one thing that might be even more fun than trout fishing is fishing in salt water. And I've never even had a true saltwater experience, because my only saltwater fly fishing experience has come in Alaska, where I was standing in the surf and I was casting to Dolly Varden and pink salmon and catching them in the bays off Kodiak Island. And that was an absolute blast. And I loved the feeling of standing out there in the water and casting a cruising fish. So I've had a very limited slice of what that's like, but I could see myself falling down the rabbit hole and getting addicted. I mean, if they had mountains in Florida, I'd probably move there, because then I could fish for trout and tarpon and we'd be set. But anyways, I'm sorry to go off on that tangent, but the reason that we view a lot of fly fishing through trout is I think trout fishing has always been the spiritual heart of fly fishing. And I think catching rising trout on dry flies from a river might be the most beautiful way to experience this sport. You're inserting yourself into nature in such a way that the fish either don't realize or just don't care that you're there. And it's a beautiful moment to experience the natural world in its most unassuming state. And I think that's part of the magic of trout fishing, especially on dry flies, that captures so many of us. And that's why we talk about trout so much, because there is a little bit of magic to it. But as that carp story illustrates, all of the skills that you need if you want to catch trout from a river are going to apply to almost every other fly fishing situation. And with that carp day, when I finally caved in and went with my buddy, I didn't practice beforehand. I didn't spend time out on the lawn making new casts. I didn't have to learn a new rig. I had to remind myself, okay, don't trout set tomorrow. You've got a strip set. Trout setting is when a fish eats your fly and you lift straight up with the rod to set the hook. And then strip setting, if you're fishing with streamers, when the fish eats it, if you lift the rod, you're going to pull it out of their mouth 9 times out of 10. So what you do is you keep the rod low, but you strip the line really hard and you drive that hook point home and set it. And then you can lift the rod and put the backbone of the rod into that to really drive the hook point home. So you do have to remind yourself that the strip set's the way to go sometimes. But honestly, all the skills I needed to fish for carp, I had from my trout fishing. Okay, it all translates. And Maybe not with like bluefin tuna or marlin or shellfish on the fly. Maybe it doesn't translate to those, but there are strong parallels between trout and bass, trout and panfish, and to an extent, trout and musky and pike. Okay. Now, permit. Let's talk about permit for a second, because I can talk about how trout and bass are similar, and I think folks can accept that. But trout and permit, really? Are they? Where do you get off, Durant, calling them similar? Well, permit are often touted as one of the hardest fish to catch on a fly rod. I know quite a few saltwater guys and guides who love it and talk about the challenge, and I want to go do that for myself. Hopefully I get to do that, not this year, but hopefully next year we get to go out and do it. And they are certainly tough, but they're so tough because they're so sensitive to everything. Everything will spook them. You've got to be almost perfect, okay? Ben Sittig, he's better known as Huge Fly Fisherman on YouTube. He puts it really well. He said in an article once that flats fishing for permit is a lot like fishing for other flat species. Everything is just magnified. The fish are more sensitive to the fly line, noise, vibration, the boat, which hand you reel with, what you had for breakfast that day, what color your underwear is. Everything is just a little bit tougher. Now, of course, he's kidding a bit, but the point really remains, with a tough fish like permit, you're still working to get a good presentation with a good fly in the right kind of water with as few casts as possible. That's what you're trying to do. That's everything we talk about here at Untangled, here at VFC. Good presentation, good fly, right kind of water, limit your casting. Boom. I don't know how many times I've sat behind this mic and said those exact words. Okay. Now, I actually want to dive into those a little bit more and really show you how those translate from species to species, regardless of where you're fishing. You could be in some high mountain lake chasing trout, a lowland lake targeting bowfin, snakehead, or peacock bass even, or you could be in the salt chasing tarpon or bonefish or roosterfish, but you still have to ensure that you're going to do these 4 things correctly if you want to be successful. So let's take a look at them. The first skill to talk about is presentation, because no matter what you're fishing for, you've got to make that fly look good. Otherwise, the chances of a fish eating it are pretty stinking low. So for musky, let's use them as an example. That means that you've got to swim your fly in a figure 8 before making your next cast. That's part of the presentation of a musky fly. And for those who don't know, it just means that before you lift your fly up out of the water to make another cast, you swim it in a figure 8 motion by the boat, because that can entice a muskie that hasn't committed yet to finally biting that fly. So there's one example. Presentation. You've got to do it. Panfish. Let's look at them. Presentation for panfish, it could really be as simple as just getting the fly down to the right depth, because that's where the fish are hanging out. If they're around their beds or around other structure like rocks or tree roots. I remember when I was smallmouth fishing at Flaming Gorge, last time I did it, all the smallmouth were hanging down low and they were right around the rocks. They weren't coming up for the topwater stuff. They wanted everything down lower. I think it was either right before or right after the spawn, so they were still kind of guarding their nests. So you had to get your flies right down to them. And I know bass aren't panfish, but again, you've got to get your flies in front of the fish. You've got to present them correctly. Now, if you want an example of just how similar the presentation can be for trout and bass, you really should watch the smallmouth video that Scotty over a wildfly. He just posted this on YouTube a couple of days ago. I'll link it in the show notes. Wonderfully done video. Scotty's work is always great. This one was a lot of fun. But what really stood out to me in that video is they're just fishing poppers. So they're fishing a topwater lure or a topwater fly for smallmouth bass. But the presentation of the poppers, they're in a drift boat. They're on the Mississippi River, by the way. But the presentation of those poppers was exactly what you would do with a hopper if you were trout fishing. So again, they're on a drift boat in the Mississippi in Montana, in Minnesota, okay? But how he presented those flies looks exactly as if he was on the Madison in Montana fishing hoppers. He threw cast downstream of the boat and he got them tight to the bank. It was eerily similar how close the two were. And he even talked about in the video how it feels almost like he was hopper fishing for trout. So there is a lot of overlap there with trout and bass. Now, the specifics of presentation are going to differ a little bit from species to species. When you're chasing carp, you generally want smaller, softer movements with your fly because you don't want to spook those fish. When you're chasing pike, you might want bigger, angrier movements to spark and eat. That might be what they need that day. But you're still moving the fly in a way that looks like a natural food item for that fish, which is what presentation is all about anyways. It's not about getting a drag-free drift every time. That's great for trout, and a lot of times that's what you need to be successful as a trout angler. But presentation really is putting flies in front of fish and making them look real. Whatever that means for the fish that you're chasing, that's what good presentation can be boiled down to. So that's how presentation overlaps. Now let's look at fly selection. This is our second skill. Okay. Honestly, I think fly selection is probably the hardest part of trout fishing. More than anything else, because trout will get locked into that specific bug. They're eating just the emerger of the blue-winged olive. And if you want to be successful, a lot of times you have to have at least a passable imitation of that insect in your box. Trout can get extremely, extremely picky that way. But bass, musky, pike, steelhead, salmon, and even carp to an extent, fly selection is going to matter for them too, okay? With permit, which are a great example because they might be the pickiest saltwater fish. Almost every best permit fly I've seen is some sort of crab or shrimp imitation. Those make up a big chunk of their diet, so you'll need flies that imitate those food sources. So again, picky trout, picky permit, you've got to have the right fly. You've got to pick something that looks like what they're used to eating. And even up in Alaska, when you're fishing for rainbow trout and dolly of Arden, and you're chasing them in rivers that are full of salmon, the rainbows and the dollies will follow the salmon up the river because they'll eat all the salmon eggs that get kicked out of the salmon redds. And then when the salmon die, their decaying flesh flows down the river and they'll eat that too. And that's why the rainbows and dollies get so big and fat in Alaska. They're just eating protein-rich meals all the stinking time. But even then, when it's a literal buffet of food coming at them, you often need the right size and color salmon egg imitation if you want to catch a lot of fish. You can still catch some, but if you want to catch a lot of them, you've got to have the right size and color salmon egg imitation to really get into them. So understanding the very basics of, well, I've got to match the size and shape of a natural food item is going to serve you well no matter what you are fishing for. It is going to make a difference, okay? There's very few exceptions where you're not trying to imitate some natural food item. Salmon and steelhead are a great example of that because the primary goal is to trigger a strike out of aggression. Since salmon, they don't eat very readily when they're swimming up rivers like they do when they're out at sea. So a lot of the strikes that you're getting out of salmon are aggressive, and you'll notice that a lot of the flies you use for salmon are designed to really make those movements that'll trigger and eat out of aggression. But even then, you've got to have the right stuff that's going to trigger what you are looking for out of the salmon and the steelhead. So fly selection matters, okay? It may matter to a lesser degree for some of these other fish, but it still is going to make a difference. The third skill to talk about is identifying and reading water, specifically holding water, where the fish are going to be. Because all the flies in the world make absolutely no difference if you can't read water. All right, if you don't know where the fish are going to be, it doesn't matter. You can have the right fly in the world, but if you're fishing it in the wrong spot, you're probably not going to have much success. I'll go back to that wildfly video. It does an excellent job of showing how the smallmouth bass in the Mississippi River were holding in the exact spots that I would expect to find trout. So if I was out on the Mississippi and I was just trout fishing just for the heck of it, I would be casting to the same spots they were casting their bass poppers. It was eerie almost how similar it was, okay? The point, or there's even one point in the video where Scotty talks about pulling a fish out from right in front of a rock, and that's a spot that you would always expect to find trout in. I know I do. Well, when I'm out on a new river, Those are the things that I'm looking for. A river I don't know very well, I'm looking for my rocks, I'm looking for my seams, I'm looking for my pockets, and I'm fishing the very obvious water. And that's what they did in this video. It was very obvious, good holding water for a fish. Okay. And especially in rivers, the holding water is going to largely be the same from species to species. Okay. There might be a few differences because I know that pike, for example, prefer deep, slow water. In fact, in the Green River below Flaming Gorge, there are a few pike that live in there. They've come up from the Colorado River, which the Green dumps into eventually. And the guys I know who catch the pike in there consistently catch them from the same holes because it's the same water type. It's the deeper, slower stuff where they can just kind of hang out and ambush, because that's what pike really like to do. They're ambush predators. But again, the general idea of fishing your transitions, like seams, are going to serve you well no matter what you're chasing. So that's a foundational skill, understanding what good holding water looks like and being able to identify it. You do that, you're going to be set. All right. You're going to be set like me when I went to Buffalo, New York for the first time and realized I was in the birthplace of wings and everything was great around me. That's how it's going to feel when you crack the code with reading water. You're going to just feel like you can do no wrong. Everything's perfect. And that's how I felt first time I went to Buffalo. And I think I got to make a return trip up there and fish again. But anyways, let's move on to the last skill to talk about, which is casting. Okay. Casting is the other big skill item that I think will translate, but it's also the least transitory of all of these skills if you only fish for trout. If you're only a trout angler, I think the casting is going to be one of the biggest stumbling blocks to getting into other types of fish, because tossing really big bugs on heavy fly lines to distances of 60 or more feet, that's a challenge if you've never done it before. And if you don't have a solid understanding of casting mechanics and how a fly cast works and why a fly cast works, it can be really frustrating. And I know that because the first time I tried throwing big poppers on a 7-weight for bass, it was an absolute disaster because I did not understand what I was doing. I didn't understand casting mechanics as well as I should have. To illustrate that, let's talk about when you're tossing small dry flies, 40 feet, let's say, to rising trout. That's a very typical trout fishing distance. You want nice, tight loops because you want the fly to travel on a nice straight line. That's going to give you the most accurate cast. But if you're throwing a big old streamer into a headwind, let's say, and you're on a lake, you're chasing pike, the loop naturally needs to open up. It's going to be a lot bigger because of the weight of that fly. Bigger, heavier flies will always benefit from bigger loops because that keeps things from tangling up. So you don't end up with a bird's nest like I did the first time I tried to throw poppers. And the bigger flies, they also have a lot more air resistance than the smaller ones. So a size 2 clouser minnow is naturally going to have to move in a wider arc through the air than a size 16 Adams. So you're also going to want to learn the double haul. This, even for trout fishing, you're going to want to learn it, but the double haul is going to serve you well for any other kind of fishing. It really does make a huge difference. And all the double haul is you pull down on your fly line before each casting stroke. So before the back stroke and the front stroke, you pull down on your line that's in your line hand. And what that does is it increases the line speed. So get your line moving a little bit quicker. It tightens those loops up, and it helps you, especially in a headwind, just have a little bit more inertia to get those flies going where they need to. Now, regardless of what little casting techniques you need to learn or to understand, if you understand what you're trying to accomplish with your cast, which is delivering the fly on target, and you understand how a fly cast works, you understand the mechanics of it, you're going to be successful. Because the key with casting, no matter what you're casting, if it's tiny dry flies or 6-inch long streamers, timing is the key. Your longer casts with wider loops will always be slower than your short casts with tight loops. Even with a fast action rod, you will move a bit slower than you would if you're throwing a big streamer than if you are casting small dry flies to trout on a river. So let's circle back to how I started out this part of the show, which was my story about fishing for carp, because we talked about these skills and I gave you some examples, but other than slowly working the fly and using a strip set, what skills did I not have that I needed to hone for the carp? Not a whole lot, to be completely honest. Carp are spookier than trout, so you've got to be a bit more stealthy. Your accurate casts are going to matter because you've got to put that fly in the correct spot to avoid spooking the carp. You got to make sure they see it as well. But stealthy approaches and accurate casts are two skills you need no matter what you're fishing for, and especially for trout, especially for rising trout, you've got to be able to do that. So the point of reiterating that story, bringing it back full circle, is to show you that if you're a bass angler, for example, you've got all the skills that you need to go out and fish for trout. You really honestly do. You might have to refine your fly selection a little bit, but I listed out all these skills and how similar they are. You've got the skills. The only thing that's really standing in the way is just going out and doing it for the first time, which can be a little intimidating because nobody likes to get skunked, and it's not fun to go out there and feel like you don't know what you're doing. So the key that I would recommend is to do some reading before you go out, watch some videos of how folks fish for these other fish, and you'll quickly pick up those little nuances, those little differences. That's what I did before that first carp trip, and it made a world of difference because I went into it knowing, okay, I've got to be stealthier. I've got to be very accurate with my casts, and I need slower, more subtle movements of my fly if I want to be successful with the carp today. Now, if you're a trout angler and you want to go chase, let's say, bonefish, for example, the thing that you're going to need to work on the most is probably going to be your distance casting and then casting larger flies, especially in the wind. Alex actually went bone fishing in Hawaii a few years ago, and he said the biggest struggle he had was casting accuracy in the wind. The flies he was using weren't any bigger than a woolly bugger, which we're all familiar with, but he said you've got to land your flies on a dime, you've got to minimize your false casting because bonefish are spooky. So you're going to have to refine that skill. It's not a completely new skill. Okay, as a trout angler, you have that skill, but you have to refine it just a little bit. Okay, every fish is going to require something just a little bit different. But once you start fly fishing at all, you've got the baseline skills that you need to go out there and chase those different species. You have them. Again, that biggest stumbling block is just going out there and doing it for the first time. Now, I'm sure I could find a few other examples to drive this point home, but I just hope that as we continue on here at VFC, that you'll realize that what we're doing is teaching concepts and frameworks, and that they have a much wider application than just for trout in a river. And I appreciate y'all listening through this part of the show. If you've got any questions on anything that I talked about, any feedback you'd like to get, leave a comment. I'd love to chat with you about it. But with that, folks, we are going to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly, no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a question about fly fishing that you would like answered, you can go ahead and submit those at the link in the show notes. And often those questions y'all submit become the basis for the open of the show as well, like we just saw this week. So make sure you're sending those questions on in to us. And our first one this week comes to us from Craig from Missouri, writes in and says, Spencer, I appreciate so much having some place to go with all my questions. Today, I was letting my nymph rig drift under an indicator for a good long way downstream. The hole was long and deep, the drift was good, and there seemed no good reason to interrupt it. But then I was left with the problem of having way too much line out to effectively or easily cast back upstream for the next drift. I managed to do it several times, but it wasn't pretty and may have spooked fish. I thought there must surely be a better way. What's my move here? Hey, Craig, you bet. Glad to get your questions from you. Thank you so much. You might be overthinking this one just a little bit, and I'm not coming down on you. Oh, you're overthinking it, Craig. You figure it out, man. No. I'm as guilty as anybody else of overthinking things. So let me explain what I mean. Okay, you're 100% right that if you've got a long drift, it can be hard to get all that fly line cast back upstream in a single cast. And if you do, it might not look all that pretty. It might not be very accurate. And especially if you've got a bobber and 2 nymphs and some split shot on there, chances are it's just going to become a tangled mess and you're going to be frustrated. And nobody likes to be frustrated while we're out fishing. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with finishing your drift and then just hold your rod directly downstream of you, because what that'll do is it's going to cause your flies to swing a little bit in the current, which might elicit a strike, as we learned on the wet flies episode a few weeks ago. But what that will cause is that they go down that run, and then if you hold your rod just directly downstream, there'll be a little belly in the line, it'll straighten out, and then all of a sudden it's going to pull those flies out of the run, and they're in the quicker stuff or maybe shallower stuff or deeper stuff. They're in the water that you don't think the fish are in. Okay? That will move them right out. And then all you got to do is just strip that loose line back up until you feel like you can handle the cast, make your cast, and then you can use that loose line that you stripped in to throw mends and extend the drift right back down to where you want it. So get those flies out of the way, point the rod downstream, let the flies swing, strip in, make your cast, boom. That's all you've really got to do. Now, with all this being said, I shy away from long drifts a lot anymore because they can, A, be really hard to cast, like we just saw, and then B, setting the hook at distance can be pretty tough too. So I do shy away from that. I like a bit more control over my drifts, and the more line I have out, the less control that I feel I have. So it's a personal preference, but that's how I like to run my rigs. I've really paid attention to that actually and shortened things up quite a bit in the last few years, and that's helped me out. But fly fishing is a very personal thing, so try it out and see what helps you. I appreciate the question, Craig. Thanks so much for sending it in. Andy from Utah has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, I've been listening for a few months now, and I believe that my skills as an angler have improved since then because of what I've learned from you guys. The knowledge I've gained about aquatic insects alone has been more than priceless. Thank you guys so much. In your experience, what length and weight fly rod would you say is runner-up to the 9-foot 5-weight in terms of versatile performance? I'm looking to branch out and have had my eyes on a 10-foot 4-weight for a while, thinking that I could buy 2 spools and use it for Euro nymphing as well as lighter dry fly and dry dropper rigs. Thanks for taking on my question. Tight lines, brothers." Andy, thank you for the kind words and for sending the question in. I really appreciate it. This is a really good question too. I spent more time thinking about this one than maybe I should have. So anytime you send in a fly rod question, that's what you're going to get out of me. You're going to get a lot of pondering. I've got a thing or two to say about fly rods, dadgummit. So what you're looking for is you're looking for a rod that can essentially do 3 things based on your question. You want it to Euro nymph, you want it to be able to throw dries, and you also want it to be able to throw dry dropper rigs as well. Most rods that will throw dries are going to throw a dry dropper rig just fine as well. But when you start getting into the lighter size of rods, you're limited in the size of flies that you can throw, because remember, fly line weight directly correlates to the fly size. So the larger the fly line weight, the bigger flies that you can throw. Once you get below about a 4-weight, you're fairly limited on the size of nymphs that you can throw in a dry dropper rig, and even the size of the dry fly too at that point. I don't use 4-weights for hopper dropper rigs, for example. They just don't quite have the oomph and the power to turn those over. I like a 6-weight for dry dropper rigs, but a 4-weight is great for like a size 16 caddis and a size 18 zebra midge dry dropper kind of rig, for example. Euro rods. Euro rods are specifically designed for Euro nymphing and tend to have very stiff butt sections, which help you make the lob cast that you use in Euro nymphing but that stiff butt section plus all the extra length of the rod means that Euro rods have a lot more swing weight. And swing weight is just how heavy the rod feels as you're casting it. Rods with light swing weights are very pleasant to cast. They don't feel heavy. You can cast them all day. You don't feel fatigued by it. Your shoulder won't get sore. And if your shoulder gets sore from a day of casting, that you might be doing a couple of things wrong, or you just might not be out there very much too. So don't worry that shoulder pain is a sign that you're doing something wrong. But those Euro rods can be unpleasant, especially if it's specifically designed for Euro nymphing. They could be a little unpleasant to cast dries and dry dropper rigs with. So that's with your Euro rod. Now, the dry fly specific rods are often a little bit shorter. 8 foot and 8.5 foot are great dry fly rod lengths. So they're not as versatile as a 9 foot or even a 10 foot rod. So with all that in mind, all that info, I think the 10 foot 4-way is really a good decision based on what kind of fishing that you want to do. For your situation, though, I think you would be in good shape with that 10 foot 4-way. But the key is to buy one that isn't designed as a dedicated Euro rod, because like I mentioned, those rods don't tend to be as versatile as the non-specialty rods. Give you an example. Sage makes a 10 foot 4-weight version of their R8 core, which is their flagship rod, and it's billed as a small nymphing / indicator rod, but it will cast dries just fine. I've tossed it, does a great job with those. The new EDC from Redington, it's a brand new fly rod. It's mid-priced. It's like $330, so it's not a 1,050 like the R8 core is. That new EDC from Redington comes in a 10 foot 4-weight, and it specifically says it is designed to fish dry flies and small nymphs. So of the two, I might lean towards that Redington just a little bit more, even though it's a little cheaper, just because it says it's designed for dry flies, small nymphs. So you want to look at what the rod is designed for before you pull the trigger on anything, and I think you'll be in business. Now, that said, you can find some sneaky good ones sometimes, because I have a 9 foot 9 inch 3-weight Hardy Ultralight LL. Yes, that's the model. And that thing, my goodness, 9 foot 9 3-weight. It's a sneaky good dry dropper rod, and I would not have ever expected that, but I went to the river one day, and it was the only thing I had, and I wanted to throw dry dropper and not Euro nymph, and threw that on, and I was kind of blown away at how great it was. So every now and then you might find something that'll surprise you, but by and large, stick for the stuff that's designed for what you want to do. You're going to get a better experience with that, in my opinion. My personal fishing, I also thought you might want to hear about this. If I had to pick a rod as a runner-up to my 9 foot 5-weight for versatility, I wouldn't go 10 foot 4-weight, just based on what I do. I would go with a 9.5 foot 6-weight, because it gives me a little bit of extra reach and oomph for those bigger bugs, but it'll still handle a lot of the dry fly work that I do as well. It's not as versatile as a 9 foot 5, but it's pretty stinking close. So that's just my 2 cents on it. But anytime I get to talk fly rods, I'm happy about that. So thank you so much, Andy. I appreciate it. Corey from Virginia has our next question, writes in and says, I am looking at possibly creating my own tapered leaders. What is your opinion on this? I know it has a higher chance of breakage, as there are more knots, of course, but would it be worth it? Would all the knots cause the line to sink quicker? Also, I know there are leader kits, but would it have the same effect if I just bought regular fishing line with specific diameters to create these leaders? Or should I buy the leader kit? My goal is to create streamer, dry fly, and nymph leaders using regular fishing line with specific formulas I found online. Also, it would be pretty cool if you all did a YouTube video of tying knots, specifically the blood knot, as I cannot for the life of me accomplish this knot. I appreciate the podcast / YouTube videos, as it certainly has heightened my skills and allows me to view various perspectives on topics. Without the podcast, I certainly would not be able to slay Appalachian brookies. P.S. Diet Coke is on top. Corey, thanks for the question. And I hope my Rocky Mountain pronunciation of Appalachia was correct. Honest question I know we have a lot of listeners over there. I've heard both pronunciations from folks who live over there. I've heard Appalachian and Appalachian. Is there a correct one? I would like to know, because former English teacher, I want to pronounce things correctly. So if there's a correct way to say it, and I've heard that Appalachian is, but I would like to hear from folks who live there. Let me know. Anyways, I might catch some heat for this, but I think tying up leaders is largely a waste of time for a majority of fly fishing situations, unless you're doing some sort of contact nymphing technique like Euro nymphing. These single piece tapered leaders that come in the package, they have always performed better for me than custom tied leaders. The caveat here is that I'm saying in my experience. I know there are folks out there who are going to hear that and, oh, Durant, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. Let me tell you about this Harvey Goldie. I understand, and I'm not ragging on your stuff. I'm telling you from my own experience, I have not seen an appreciable enough difference to make me think that it's worth the time to tie those versus just buying the packaged leaders. And it doesn't even have anything to do with the fact that the more knots a leader that has in it, the more likely it is to break. It doesn't even have anything to do with that. Last year, Alex and I actually played around with a bunch of custom tied leaders. We were curious if that was something we wanted to look at, maybe adding to the VFC store, promoting. But after like a half dozen trips fishing these leaders, there were dry fly ones, there were nymph ones, there's even a couple of streamer ones. I didn't see any appreciable difference between them and my regular leaders. In fact, I think the custom tied leaders were a little bit worse. They weren't as good at turning flies over. I didn't feel like they had the sensitivity. I don't feel like they cast as smoothly as packaged leaders do, like the ones you buy at the fly shop or that we have here at VFC. And again, this is all within the context of the type of fishing that I do most often, which is dry dropper setups on Western rivers for trout. So that's my experience. And that's where I can say, I don't think this makes a difference. Spring creeks, limestone streams in Pennsylvania, it really might make a world of difference. I haven't fished in Pennsylvania, so I can't speak to that. I'm just speaking to my experience here, and I'm not trying to rag on anybody else who's doing it their way, especially because so many anglers I know and respect tie their own leaders. Dom Swintoski at Trout Bitten ties a lot of his own leaders. Brian Flessick at Mad River Outfitters. How many leader videos has he done on YouTube? Brian, I love your videos. They're fantastic, but you do a lot of leader videos, and I love the fact that there's so many out there. It's awesome. It really is. But he really gets into the weeds on that stuff. And for their areas and for their fisheries, it probably makes a huge difference. For my stuff, it just doesn't. Now, if I'm in a situation where I'm out on the river and I need to add some length to my leader, maybe I need to get my flies down deeper, or I need to size down to get to a picky fish that's refusing my dry flies, then I'll do that stream side. I'll construct that leader stream side with the tippet that I've got. But I'm tying that onto a base section of a leader that ideally, all of my leaders that I use are either 3X or 4X. I don't use 5X leaders anymore because I like the stiffness of the 3 and the 4X to turn bigger flies over or to handle bigger flies in the wind. And then if I need more subtlety or if I need a slightly softer presentation, then I just tie on some extra tippet stream side if I need to go down to 5X. I don't go down to 6X very often anymore. But if I got to go down to 5, I can do that on my leader. I really like how that turns over. And just to really add on to this point, I was talking last week with one of my good buddies, Ryan Kelly. He's Green River Fly Fisher on Instagram. And I've known Ryan for years. Really good guy. One of the best anglers I've ever met. He catch fish out of a storm drain. That's the kind of guy he is. And we're talking about small flies and leaders and whatnot. And he just kind of laughed because I used to be the small fly guy. I was big on it. I had 8X tippet with me all the time. I was fishing size 26s, and I've talked about that here on the show. I enjoyed doing that. It can be a lot of fun. But in the last 4 or 5 years, I think I can count on one hand how many times I've sized down to 6X tippet. I'm just not using lighter stuff anymore. And Ryan, It's funny because when he and I used to fish together a lot when I lived in Utah, he would give me a hard time for all my small fly stuff because he would fish just straight sections of Berkeley Vanish fluorocarbon, and that was his leader. And it still is his leader, and he catches way more fish than I have, and he's caught more fish than I probably will ever catch in my life. On top of that, he's an incredibly good guide, and that's what he rigs up for his clients. Does extremely well with it. So you will find outliers like that where, you know, if you get that presentation just right, you might not need all this specialty stuff. And again, I know that some folks are going to swear by their leaders, especially the Harvey Gold dry fly leader formula in particular. And I'm sure it works for them. I'm sure it is effective for them on their fisheries. And I don't want to discourage anyone from trying that because there is no right way to fly fish. We talk about that all the time here. What works for you, and that's awesome. I'm just giving you my 2 cents that I really have not found the ROI on tying my own leaders versus using the packaged ones. Now, I can't speak specifically to the leader kits that you asked about. I've never made my own leaders from those. I just went ahead and bought the spools of Maxima line and then used spools of nylon fishing line to make my leaders. But we do have a video on some knots, Corey, so I'll link that in the show notes in case you missed that video. Hopefully it'll be helpful. But that's all I've got to say about leaders this time. I'm sure we'll get another leader question soon, but I appreciate the question, Corey. Thank you. Every week we end the show with a story from someone in the VFC audience who is out there living real life. So if you've got a story that you would like to share, please submit that at the link in the show notes. We love to see and hear about all the great things y'all are doing out on the water. So send those on in when you can. And this week's Live Real Life moment comes to us from Jordan, writes in and says, I started fly fishing last year, but I found myself frequently grabbing my spinning rod when heading to my local stream because I would get increasingly frustrated with how much I sucked. This turned into a vicious circle of not improving, but how would I improve if I didn't just go out and suck? And then I discovered your YouTube channel and ultimately the podcast. It was then that I heard Spencer say he made a conscious choice to focus on fly fishing over spinning when he was younger, and I made that choice at the end of last season. I honestly owe so much to you guys for helping me break through the learning barrier and enjoy an incredible season so far. I tied my first flies from your videos and then caught on those flies. A 3-pound grayling on a hare's ear nymph was my first. Your videos and podcasts have taught me countless things, like how to nymph, how to read water, and they have also kept me motivated to keep going out and learning. One thing that has evaded me all season, however, was my first fish caught on a dry fly. That was until last Thursday when this little guy graced my net. I hit the river at 5:30 a.m. when my 2 toddlers were sleeping, and boy, did it pay off. Tying on a zebra midge, I tried my usual pulls and runs, but had no luck. And just as I was about to pack up and head home, I saw a rise about 50 meters. Apologies for using the metric system. I live in Wales. Downstream at the head of a pool I'd already fished. I quickly tied on a parachute Adams and hastily made my way back down and cast it out. On the second cast, bang, that brownie hit that fly like a great white taking out a seal. I've never been so happy to get a fish to the net, and I can now see what all the fuss is about when it comes to dry flies. What a rush. It may be small, but it'll go down as one of my favorite catches, and here's a little video of me putting him back to go and get big. Jordan, that's a fantastic story. I love that so much. Thank you. And thanks for the really kind words that you had to say about VFC. Really appreciate that too. That's why we do what we do here. And I need to give a little shout out to Jordan because as cool as this story is, Jordan is fantastic. He's very active in our online community. He's incredibly positive. He's incredibly welcoming. He's always sharing pictures of flies that he's tied, fish that he's caught. He's got stories. He's just a fish catching machine. Really good feller. And if you're not part of our online community, we've got a little group we run at a place called School, and it's like Facebook, but it doesn't suck. It's the best way to describe it, but it's a place where you can come and learn from folks, grow your skills, talk shop, talk fishing, share fly patterns and catches. And there's a link to join it in the show notes. So if you're not part of it, come hang out and get a chance to meet Jordan, meet the feller behind this story. Because again, that's just That's why we go out and fish, is for experiences and moments like that. I love it. Thank you so much for sending it in. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the show this week. Thank you for being here with us to the end of the show. I appreciate it. Makes a huge difference. And if you could, please make sure you rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we reach and can help live real life. And if you need any other help with anything about fly fishing, we've got tons of links to fly fishing content, so check those out. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, have some fun, and live real life.